There's a quiet kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing too much, but from carrying too much for too long. And many people do not even realize when it starts, because it disguises itself as responsibility, as maturity, as being the strong one everyone relies on, until one day you wake up and realize your mind never truly rests, even when your body stops. Slowly, you begin to believe that if you are not holding everything together, something will fall apart. So you start carrying outcomes that are not yours, emotions that are not yours, fears about the future that no human being was designed to control, and without noticing, your life becomes a constant state of pressure instead of peace. But there is a breaking point hidden inside that pattern, because no matter how strong someone is, the human soul was never built to function under infinite weight, and what looks like strength from the outside often becomes silent collapse on the inside. And this is where a deeper truth begins to surface, not as a motivational idea, but as a necessary correction. Not everything that feels urgent belongs in your hands, and not everything that depends on your care was assigned to your control. There is a difference between responsibility and replacement, between doing your part and trying to hold the entire structure of life together by force. And many people only discover that difference when exhaustion has already taken too much from them. Real peace does not begin when everything finally works out, but when you stop believing that everything depends on you holding it all together. And in that moment, something inside finally exhales for the first time in a long time, because you were never meant to carry existence alone. There is a kind of strength that the world praises, but the soul quietly suffers under, and it is the pressure of always having to be the one who holds everything together, the one who does not break, the one who keeps functioning no matter how heavy things become inside. Over time, this role stops being a choice and starts feeling like identity, as if showing weakness would somehow undo your value, so you learn to hide exhaustion behind silence, to mask emotional fatigue behind productivity, and to keep moving even when something inside you is clearly asking to stop. But what most people never realize is that this constant need to be strong creates a slow internal fracture, because emotions that are never acknowledged do not disappear, they accumulate. And what is not released eventually starts to reshape you from within in ways you do not immediately notice. Even the idea of strength becomes distorted, turning into something that demands isolation instead of support, control instead of honesty, endurance instead of healing. And yet, in contrast to everything culture often teaches, real human depth is not found in the absence of vulnerability, but in the courage to stop pretending that you are unaffected by what has deeply affected you. There is something profoundly healing in recognizing that even the strongest people are still human, still limited, still in need of moments where they are not carrying the emotional weight of everything around them. And sometimes the beginning of restoration is not when you finally become stronger, but when you finally stop forcing yourself to be unbreakable in order to feel worthy of continuing. There are moments in life when you can be surrounded by people, responsibilities, conversations, and still feel like no one is actually reaching the part of you that is quietly struggling beneath everything you present on the outside, and that creates a type of pain that is not loud but persistent because it lives in the gap between what you feel and what you can safely express. Over time, many people begin to adapt to this gap by shrinking their truth, filtering their emotions, and only sharing what feels acceptable for others to hear until they slowly become strangers to their own inner experience. And the most dangerous part of being misunderstood is not the misunderstanding itself, but the conclusions it starts to plant inside you. That maybe your experience is too complex to be valid, too heavy to be acknowledged, or too inconvenient to be fully heard. But truthfully, Not all pain is meant to be easily translated into words, because some experiences are lived in layers that only time, reflection, and depth can begin to touch. And even when no one around you fully understands what you are carrying, that does not reduce the reality of what you are living internally. There is a form of relief that does not come from being perfectly understood by people, but from no longer measuring your worth by how well others can interpret your struggle, and instead learning to stand grounded in the reality that your inner world is still seen, still known, and still held, even when it is not spoken out loud. And sometimes healing begins at the exact point where you stop trying to make your pain simple enough for others and start allowing yourself to exist fully, even in what others cannot fully grasp. There are seasons in life that feel like a loss of direction, where nothing around you makes clear sense anymore, and what once felt stable begins to feel unfamiliar. Almost as if you were placed in a space where the usual signs of progress disappear, and all you are left with is uncertainty and silence. And in moments like this, the human instinct is to interpret confusion as failure, or to assume that being in a difficult season means something has gone wrong, either in your choices, your timing, or your path. But not every difficult season is a signal of collapse. Some seasons are designed to remove the noise that used to distract you, even if that removal feels uncomfortable, because clarity is often born in environments where external validation is no longer available. The wilderness, in its deeper sense, is not only a place of hardship, but a place where dependence is reshaped, where control is weakened, and where you are forced to confront what remains when everything external becomes unstable. And although it feels like isolation, it often becomes the space where internal strength is rebuilt in ways that comfort never could produce. Because, when everything familiar is stripped away, you are left with what is real, what is essential, and what cannot be taken from you. And sometimes what feels like being lost is actually being separated from what was keeping you from seeing more clearly, even if that clarity only arrives slowly after you have walked through what felt like unnecessary silence. There is a kind of battle that does not happen in the world around you, but in the quiet space of your own mind, where thoughts appear uninvited, repeating themselves, reshaping your emotions before you even realize what is happening, and slowly turning simple moments into heavy internal conversations that no one else can see. And what makes this battle so exhausting is that it does not announce itself as danger. It often disguises itself as logic, as reflection, as being realistic, until you start accepting thoughts that quietly weaken your sense of stability without ever questioning their origin. Over time, the mind can become a place where fear is rehearsed more than hope, where worst-case scenarios feel more familiar than peace, and where you begin to react to imagined outcomes as if they are already happening. But not every thought that enters your mind deserves authority over your life, and not every feeling created in a moment of anxiety is a reflection of truth. There is a deeper space within human awareness where you can observe your thoughts instead of becoming them. And that shift changes everything, because it restores distance between who you are and what you temporarily think. And in that distance, something important returns: clarity, choice, and the ability to interrupt patterns that were silently shaping your emotional world. Peace does not come from having a silent mind, but from no longer allowing every thought to become a verdict about your life. There is a subtle kind of suffering that does not always feel like pain at first, because it is disguised as responsibility, as caution, as being prepared for anything. But over time, it becomes a constant inner tension that never fully allows you to rest in the present moment. It begins with small thoughts about what could go wrong, what might fail, what could be lost, and slowly those thoughts stop being occasional and start becoming a background noise that follows you everywhere you go. And the most deceptive part of this state is that it gives you the illusion of control, as if worrying more could somehow protect you from uncertainty, when in reality, it only steals your ability to experience peace while nothing is even happening yet. Life, however, does not respond to constant mental forecasting, and the future does not become safer because you suffer through it in advance inside your mind. There is a difference between being aware and being consumed, between preparing wisely and living trapped in outcomes that have not arrived. And many people only realize the cost of this pattern when they notice that even in calm moments, their mind refuses to be calm, as if peace itself feels unfamiliar or unsafe. But peace is not something that appears after everything is resolved. It is something that must be protected even while nothing is resolved. And sometimes the first step toward reclaiming your life is not solving more problems, but refusing to let your imagination keep you imprisoned in versions of the future that have not happened and may never happen. There are moments in life when you slowly lose touch with who you are, not because you disappear all at once, but because small compromises, repeated over time, begin to reshape the way you see yourself until you no longer recognize the person who is making decisions, reacting to situations, or simply trying to get through the day. It does not happen suddenly, it happens quietly, when you start adjusting your behavior too often to fit expectations, to avoid conflict, to maintain approval, or to survive environments that demand more adaptation than authenticity. And at some point, you begin to operate more from pressure than from identity, more from reaction than from direction, until your sense of self becomes something you remember rather than something you actively live. But identity is not something that disappears. It is something that gets buried under layers of noise, fear, comparison, and survival patterns that slowly take the center of your attention. And when you reach that point, the real question is not who have I become, but what have I been consistently listening to that shaped me into this version? Because what you repeatedly absorb eventually becomes what you express, and what you consistently accept eventually becomes what you believe about yourself. And rebuilding identity is not about becoming someone new, but about removing everything that was never truly aligned with who you were meant to be in the first place. There are wounds that do not stay in the past because they were never fully processed, only paused, and anything that is paused emotionally without resolution has a way of returning at unexpected moments, often triggered by situations that seem unrelated on the surface but are deeply connected underneath. And what makes this kind of pain especially difficult is that it does not always feel like active suffering. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation, mistrust, emotional distance, or the inability to fully relax, even when everything appears to be fine. Over time, a person can begin to build protective patterns around that wound, not because they want to live guarded, but because something inside still remembers what it felt like to be hurt in a way that was not fully understood or properly healed. And the challenge is that these protective patterns, while they once served a purpose, can eventually start to limit connection, peace, and openness in ways that feel invisible until you start noticing how often you hold back without knowing exactly why. But healing does not come from pretending the wound never existed, and it does not come from forcing yourself to move on faster than your emotional reality allows. It comes from the willingness to stop reopening what was never given space to close properly, to stop reliving what is already over, and to slowly separate what happened from what is still happening inside your mind. And in that separation, something begins to loosen, not because the past changes, but because your relationship with it finally does. There are prayers that feel unanswered not because they were ignored, but because time itself becomes part of the process you were never meant to see in full detail. And that creates a tension between what you asked for and what is currently happening, where silence can feel like absence, even when something deeper is unfolding beneath it. And in those long seasons of waiting, The human mind naturally tries to fill the gap with interpretations, assuming delay means denial, or that persistence means nothing is changing, when in reality, some transformations require layers of preparation that cannot be rushed without altering what the outcome is meant to become. What often feels like delay is sometimes protection from outcomes you are not yet ready to carry, or development of internal strength that must match external answers, because receiving something before you are able to sustain it can create a different kind of loss. And yet waiting remains one of the most emotionally complex experiences a person can go through, because it forces you to live without immediate evidence while still being asked to trust the process you cannot see. But not every unanswered moment is empty, and not every silence is inactive. Some of the most important shifts happen without visible signs, slowly aligning circumstances, timing, and internal readiness in ways that only make sense in hindsight. And sometimes what is being shaped in the waiting is not only the situation you are praying about, but also the person you are becoming while you wait for it. There are moments in life when God feels silent, not in a way that removes his presence, but in a way that removes your ability to clearly interpret what he is doing. And that creates a kind of emotional distance where you are still living, still moving, still praying, but internally questioning whether anything is being heard at all. And this silence can be one of the most difficult experiences, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being explained in real time, leaving you without the comfort of understanding and forcing you to continue without clarity. In those seasons, the human tendency is to equate silence with absence, to assume that if there is no response, there is no engagement. But many of the most significant shifts in life do not come with immediate interpretation. They come with delayed understanding. There is a difference between feeling alone and being alone, just as there is a difference between not seeing movement and nothing actually moving. And often, what feels like distance is actually a different kind of work happening beneath the surface of your awareness, where timing, direction, and internal alignment are being shaped in ways that cannot be fully perceived in the moment. But silence has a way of testing perception because it forces you to rely on something deeper than immediate feedback. And that is where trust becomes less about emotion and more about endurance. And sometimes the purpose of silence is not to remove you from connection, but to remove your dependence on constant confirmation, so that what remains is not fragile belief, but something more grounded, steady, and resilient than what reaction alone can sustain. There is a kind of strength that is not visible until life begins to break what used to hold you together, and only then you discover what was real underneath everything you relied on, because brokenness has a way of revealing what comfort used to hide. And when people go through loss, failure, disappointment, or seasons where things no longer function the way they once did, it can feel like something essential has been taken away. But often what is being exposed is not the end of strength, but a different kind of strength that was never meant to depend on stability. In moments like these, it becomes clear that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the ability to remain standing even when the internal structure has been shaken. And what makes brokenness so transformative is that it strips away illusions of control, forcing you to confront life without the protections you once depended on, which can feel disorienting, but also deeply revealing. Because when everything external becomes uncertain, you are left with what cannot be easily removed: your perspective, your values, your capacity to endure, and the quiet parts of you that were developing even while everything else seemed to be falling apart. And sometimes what feels like collapse is actually the beginning of a deeper kind of stability, one that is not built on circumstances, but on something far more internal and enduring than what was lost. There comes a point where emotional exhaustion is no longer just about being tired, but about feeling internally depleted in a way that rest alone does not immediately fix, because it is not the body that is overwhelmed, but the mind and heart that have been carrying too much for too long without proper release. And in that state, even simple responsibilities can feel heavier than they should, not because they are objectively difficult, but because your internal capacity has been stretched beyond what is sustainable in silence. Many people try to push through this condition by continuing to function as normal. But functioning is not the same as healing, and survival mode slowly replaces genuine living when recovery is never prioritized. What makes this exhaustion particularly dangerous is that it can become invisible from the outside, while internally everything feels slowed down, disconnected, or emotionally muted, as if parts of you are still operating but no longer fully engaged. And yet, there is a form of wisdom that begins to emerge when you stop interpreting exhaustion as failure and start recognizing it as a signal, a clear indication that something within you needs restoration rather than further pressure. Rest is not a reward for finishing everything. It is a requirement for continuing in a healthy way, and ignoring that truth only extends the depletion you are trying to escape. And sometimes the most important step forward is not to keep pushing through what is already breaking you, but to finally acknowledge that even your inner world has limits that deserve to be respected. There is a power in words that is often underestimated, not because words are magical on their own, but because they constantly shape the way you interpret your own life. And over time, the language you repeat internally begins to form the emotional environment you live inside without you consciously noticing it. And many people, especially in difficult seasons, develop a habit of speaking to themselves in ways they would never speak to someone they care about, repeating assumptions about failure, limitation, or inadequacy, until those phrases begin to feel like identity rather than temporary thoughts. But what you consistently say, even in private moments, does not stay neutral. It gradually influences how you respond to challenges, how you interpret setbacks, and how you define what is possible for your future. There is a difference between acknowledging reality and reinforcing defeat, just as there is a difference between honesty and self-diminishment disguised as truth. And changing your life does not always begin with changing circumstances, but with changing the language that has been quietly shaping your emotional framework for years. Because when your internal dialogue shifts, your perception of options begins to shift as well, and what once felt fixed can slowly become open again. And sometimes the first step toward a different life is not louder effort, but quieter awareness of how often your own words have been limiting the very direction you're trying to move toward. There is a quiet comparison that happens in the background of many lives, not always spoken, not always even noticed, but constantly present through observation, through subtle measuring, through the unconscious habit of evaluating your own path against the visible progress of others. And what makes comparison so damaging is that it rarely shows the full picture. It highlights outcomes while hiding process. It shows moments while hiding struggles. And it creates the illusion that everyone else is moving with clarity while you are somehow behind in a race you never agreed to run. Over time, this distorted perception begins to reshape how you value your own life, making what you have feel smaller than it is, and what you lack feel more urgent than it truly needs to be. But no life is formed under identical conditions. No journey unfolds with the same timing, and no personal path carries the same internal lessons or unseen weight, even if the external appearance looks similar. And when you constantly measure your life against someone else's visible moments, you lose the ability to recognize the significance of your own unseen progress, the kind that does not generate attention but still represents real growth. There is a point where awareness must replace comparison, where you stop interpreting your life through someone else's timeline and begin to understand it through your own process. And sometimes peace does not come from gaining more, but from no longer interpreting your worth through a standard that was never designed for your journey in the first place. There is a kind of pain that does not always show itself through noise or visible breakdowns, but through silent accumulation, where moments of sadness, disappointment, or loss are experienced deeply, yet not fully expressed, as if the heart has learned to contain more than it releases. And over time, this quiet form of suffering can make a person feel unseen not only by others, but even by life itself, as though their tears have no place to go and their emotional weight is carried without acknowledgement or relief. But what is often forgotten in these hidden struggles is that nothing truly experienced is ever wasted in the deeper structure of a person's life, even when it feels unnoticed or unacknowledged in real time. There are moments that shape resilience in ways that comfort never could, not by diminishing the pain, but by slowly transforming how it is carried and understood. And although it is difficult to recognize in the middle of it, even the most silent tears leave an imprint that influences strength, perspective, and depth in ways that only become clear much later. Because not every form of suffering is meant to be immediately resolved. Some of it is meant to refine, to deepen, and to reveal parts of you that could not emerge under easier circumstances. And sometimes, what feels like unseen sorrow is actually a process that is still meaningful, even if its meaning is not yet visible to you in the present moment. There are endings in life that do not feel like closure, but like interruption, as if something was taken away before it reached its expected conclusion, leaving behind questions that do not resolve easily and emotions that do not immediately find their place. And when doors close, especially the ones you did not feel ready to lose, it can create a sense of instability, not only about what was lost, but about what it means for everything that comes after. But not every closure is a sign of failure. And not every separation is an indicator that something went wrong in your life. Sometimes what ends is simply what could no longer continue in the same form without compromising something essential within you. And in the moment of loss, it is difficult to see beyond the immediate absence, because the mind naturally focuses on what is missing rather than what is being protected or redirected. Yet over time, it often becomes clearer that some endings remove weight that was quietly shaping your direction in ways you could not fully perceive while you were still inside them. There is a difference between what feels like loss and what functions as redirection, even if both carry emotional discomfort in the beginning. And sometimes the closing of a door is not a statement about your worth, but about timing, alignment, and the natural limit of certain seasons in your life. And what feels like something being taken away may eventually reveal itself as something making space for a path you could not yet see while holding on to what had already reached. There are moments in life when faith is no longer supported by feeling, when there is no emotional clarity, no visible confirmation, and no internal sense of motivation that makes things easier to continue, and yet life still requires you to move forward, as if something within you remains anchored even when everything around you feels emotionally neutral or distant. And in these seasons, many people begin to mistake the absence of feeling for the absence of direction, assuming that if they do not feel connected, then something must be wrong, when in reality, emotional states are not always reliable indicators of spiritual or personal alignment. What makes this experience challenging is that human nature tends to depend heavily on emotional reinforcement, and when that reinforcement disappears, consistency becomes harder to maintain, not because truth has changed, but because perception has become quieter. But there is a deeper form of commitment that does not rely on emotional intensity, a steadiness that exists even when internal signals are weak or unclear. And this kind of faith is often shaped more by endurance than by inspiration. And although it feels empty in the moment, this kind of season has a way of strengthening inner stability because it forces reliance on something deeper than temporary emotional confirmation. And sometimes the most important growth happens not when you feel deeply connected, but when you continue moving with quiet persistence, even when nothing inside you is loudly responding. There is a kind of joy that does not depend on circumstances improving, but on something deeper that remains intact, even when external situations are uncertain, delayed, or unresolved. And this kind of joy is often misunderstood because it does not always look like happiness on the surface. And many people search for emotional relief in changing conditions, assuming that peace will naturally follow when life becomes easier. But experience often shows that even improved circumstances do not always resolve internal unrest if the foundation of that unrest has not been addressed. True emotional stability is not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to remain grounded even when difficulty is still present, without allowing it to define every part of your inner experience. And this does not mean ignoring pain or pretending that challenges do not exist, but rather refusing to let those challenges become the only lens through which life is interpreted. There is a difference between what happens to you and what those events are allowed to become within you, and that difference often determines whether your inner world is constantly shaken or quietly anchored. And over time, people begin to realize that some of the most meaningful forms of peace are not produced by external change, but by an internal shift in how life is held and understood. And sometimes joy is not the result of everything being right, but of something within you remaining steady even when not everything is. There are people in life who begin to feel invisible not because they lack ability, intelligence, or value, but because they do not fit into the patterns that are most easily recognized or celebrated by others. And over time, this can create a silent questioning of self-worth that grows not from failure itself, but from comparison to visible forms of success. And what makes this experience particularly heavy is that society often highlights certain paths, certain personalities, and certain outcomes, while leaving little space for the quieter, slower, or less conventional forms of growth that are still deeply meaningful even if they do not attract attention. But being overlooked does not mean being insignificant, and being unrecognized does not mean being unimportant. It often only means that the value of a person's process is not immediately visible to those who are measuring from the outside. There are forms of development that happen away from recognition, where character is shaped, resilience is built, and understanding deepens in ways that do not require external validation to be real. And over time, many people discover that what felt like invisibility was actually a season of preparation, where what was being formed internally was more important than what could be seen externally. And sometimes the most meaningful impact a person carries is not in how loudly they are noticed, but in how deeply they have been shaped by what they have quietly endured and learned along the way. There comes a moment in life when you stand at the edge of exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional and internal, where the idea of continuing feels heavier than the circumstances themselves, and the mind begins to question whether anything meaningful is still ahead, or whether everything has already cost too much. And in that space, quitting can start to feel like relief, not because you no longer care, but because you have cared for so long without visible return that silence begins to feel like the only available answer. But this is often the exact point where life is closer than it appears, not because circumstances are instantly changing, but because something within you is at a threshold of transformation that only becomes visible after you pass through it. Many moments that feel like the end are actually transitions that only reveal their meaning in hindsight, when distance allows you to see what pressure was shaping inside you while nothing external seemed to move. And what feels like delay, silence, or stagnation is sometimes the final stretch before things begin to align in ways that could not have been accessed without enduring what came before. But the most important truth in this moment is not about what will happen next, but about refusing to let temporary exhaustion make permanent decisions about your future. Because very often, what feels like the closest point to giving up is also the point where something significant is closest to being formed, even if you cannot yet see it.